Hey there, my name is Brian. I'm Senior Developer Educator here at Clerk. We recently overhauled our integration with Supabase. So in this video, I'm going to guide you through how that integration works so you have a better understanding of it. We're going to start by comparing how Clerk functions in a traditional application setup, and then demonstrating how authentication and authorization differs when you're using Clerk with Supabase. And then we're going to dive into a more practical demo where you will see the integration being set up and configured and used in a more real-world environment. We're going to start by looking at what the typical setup of an application looks like. You have your front end, which could also be construed as the user's browser or device, and then you have a backend, which consists of an API that's used to proxy data to the database, which is also part of the backend. Now, in this setup, the client is going to make a request for some data through the API. The API is then going to transform that request into something that the database can understand and then send the request off to the database. Once the database processes the query and returns the data to the API will then send that data back to the client in a way that the client can understand and parse to be displayed on their screen. Now let's take a look at this configuration with Clerk added into the mix, specifically the authentication portion. Authentication refers to the process of identifying your users, so this way when they make a request to the service knows they should be able to access the service in the first place. This process starts by the user signing in with Clerk, and Clerk will create a JWT or token that gets sent back to the client so they can use it with subsequent requests to your service. Every single request that goes to your service is going to include this JWT, which the backend will then use to cross-reference with Clerk to verify the token is valid and that the request can be trusted. Assuming that everything is indeed valid, the entire process continues on just like you saw before. The API will request data from the database will return to the API, and the API will then send that data back to the caller. Now let's touch on the authorization side of things, which is the process of making sure that a user only has access to the things they're supposed to have access to. And this process of validating authorization rules typically happens within the API in this configuration. Now, the JWT is going to have information about the token, such as the user, who created the JWT, when it was created and when it expires, and so on and so forth. And this data is known as the claims. Now, a common claim that you'll see in most JWTs is the sub, which is shorthand for subject. In the situation of Clerk, this will always contain the unique identifier for the specific user that is making the request. Now, later in this demo, we're going to use the concept of an online writing tool. So we're going to look at a table called articles. This table has 6 columns. The first is the ID column. Second is the title, which is the title of the article, the contents of the article. Owner ID is actually what we're going to use to identify who created the article and who owns it. And then there is also 2 timestamps, created at and updated at. So knowing this, what the API will do before issuing a request to the database is it will apply a filter to its select queries to ensure that we're only returning records that have an owner ID with a value that matches the user ID inside of the JWT. So with the understanding of how Clerk works with a typical application setup, let's take a look at the same thing with Supabase. Now, the first thing you'll notice is the API and the database are actually included within Supabase as a service, meaning you don't have to build your own API in order to access data within a database. This has some trade-offs, which we're going to explore in this section. The request, however, kind of works the same. The front end is going to make requests to the API. The data API will proxy that request off to the database. Database will return the data, and then the API will return that data to the caller. Now let's move forward and add Clerk into this configuration and explore how this works. Again, mostly going to be the same as we've seen before. The user on the front end is going to sign in and receive that JWT. The front end is going to make a request to the data API, including that JWT. However, in this specific situation, since Supabase, again, is an all-encompassing service, Supabase as a whole will instead check the validity of that token against Clerk using what's called the JWKS endpoint, which we're going to explore after this. Assuming that everything is okay with the validity of the token, everything proceeds forward just as we've seen before. Every Clerk application has a dedicated endpoint that hosts this public key that can be used to verify the authenticity of tokens created by Clerk. Now, I also have the claims of a token on screen as well as a point of reference, and you'll notice that the ISS value, which is shorthand for issuer, contains the URL of the service that created the token, which corresponds with where a service provider can access the JWKS endpoint in order to verify these tokens. When you configure the Clerk and Superbase integration, you actually use the Clerk domain, which tells Supabase to cross-reference the JWKS endpoint provided by Clerk so it can verify the tokens on your behalf. With the authentication flow, let's take a look at how authorization works within Supabase. And as mentioned before, the data API that is created and provided to you by Supabase is managed by them. Therefore, you do not have the ability to modify that to add your own authorization rules. So in this specific situation, authorization actually happens on the database level using a technology by Postgres called RLS. RLS is shorthand for row level security and is essentially a security mechanism that will allow you to create policies that Supabase, or the underlying Postgres instance rather, will check whenever a request is made to the service. Now, before you can create policies, you need to enable RLS on the individual tables in which you want to create policies for. In the second screenshot here, you'll notice that on lines 1 and 2, I have the syntax that you would paste into the SQL editor within Supabase in order to turn on RLS for a specific table. And then in lines 4 and 5 of that same screenshot, you'll also notice there's syntax there for creating a policy. What this policy will essentially do is use the auth.jwt function provided by Supabase to extract the subclaim and then make sure that any records returned have that value inside of the owner ID column of the articles table that we saw earlier. In practice, what this essentially does is transforms a select star statement into a select star statement where owner ID is equal to the value of that subclaim, filtering out any records that the user should otherwise not have access to. Now, one other thing we want to touch on about this integration is the role claim. The role claim is required to be added into any JWTs used by Supabase, so this way Supabase knows which policies to apply to the specific request. And once the integration is configured from Clerk side, we'll actually add role as a managed claim on your behalf, so this way any tokens created by Clerk using the default session template will automatically include that claim, so it's compatible with Supabase going forward. We've covered a lot of information about how the Clerk and Superbase integration functions, but now it's time to take a look at a more practical real-world example. We're actually going to start in the Supabase dashboard where I'm going to show you how you can enable the integration in the first place, and then we're going to look at the source code for Quillmate, which is the demo I'll be using today. Quillmate is essentially an online writing platform that is built with Supabase and Clerk and Next.js. And then we're going to look at a couple more key details so this way you can see the entire data flow from start to finish. And with that, let's go ahead and hop over to the dashboard. I'm logged into Supabase and I'm in the project overview tab of Quillmate, which is the project I'm working with here today. To enable the Clerk integration, I can select authentication from the sidebar, select sign in/sign up, and then select third-party auth from the tabs up here. I'm going to click Add Provider and then select Clerk from the list. And in the modal that appears, there is a link here that will direct you to Clerk's Connect with Supabase page. So I'm going to go ahead and select that. You'll be prompted to sign in if you're not already, but assuming you are, you will have a list of the available organizations for your account. I'm going to leave mine at personal account. And then from my application, I'm going to select Quillmate. And then I'm going to select the development instance since I am going to be working with a local environment for the sake of this video. But once selected, you'll have a button here that says Activate Supabase Integration. I'll go ahead and click that to turn the integration on Clerk's side, which is going to add the managed claim into the session token. And then step 3 will populate with the Clerk domain that I'll need to move over into Supabase's dashboard. So I'm going to go ahead and click Copy to copy that value to my clipboard. And then back in Supabase's dashboard, we'll paste that in the Clerk domain input box and click Create Connection. So Clerk is now listed as one of my third-party authentication providers. Let's head over to VS Code so we can see what the code looks like in order to take advantage of this integration. So the first thing I want to call out is I'm using this use session function. This is a helper function provided by the Clerk SDKs, which allows you to get access to the session information as well as a few helper functions embedded within that object. And to create the client, typically you would pass in the Supabase URL as well as the Supabase key. I'm also, however, going to set the value for access token, which takes a string or a function. And then I'm going to pass an arrow function in here, which is going to call session.getToken, which is going to return the most recent version of the JWT that's stored inside of the user's browser. Next, I'm also going to pull up the migration file that is used to generate both the table as well as configure RLS on that table. Lines 1 through 9 here list the statement that creates the table with mostly the same columns that we saw inside of the slide section of this video. On line 12, I also have the statement that is going to enable row level security on the articles table that was just created. And then below that, I have 4 row level security policies which are added for this table, each to make sure that a user only has access to the records they should for the common create, read, update, and delete commands. And all of these are using Supabase's auth.jwt to access the claims from the JWT and accessing that sub claim specifically so we can extract the user ID. And then the last thing I want to show here before we jump into the demo of the application is this article page, which is the Next.js page that is going to render a specific article on the screen. I want to call out that this is a client-side component because I have used client stated right up front on the top of the page. And then if I scroll down a little bit, you could see we're using the Supabase client by selecting from articles. We're selecting all, and then we're accessing a specific article ID. However, we're not actually passing the user's ID in because Supabase, specifically Postgres' row-level security, is going to ensure that only records that are available to the currently logged in user are going to be returned based on that owner ID column. So I'm on the landing page for Quillmate, and you can see I have the waitlist component listed here for people who want to join the waitlist, but I already have an account, so I'm going to go ahead and click sign in. And I'm going to sign in with my Google account. Once logged in, the waitlist component instead now displays go to app, so I'll select that. And you can see there's a single article I have available on the left-hand side that I can select from. But I'm going to go ahead and click New Article, and let's name this article Hello World. And then I'm going to go ahead and open up the Chrome DevTools, and then specifically select the Network tab. Now, I already have a filter in here to only show commands sent to Supabase, but we can see one of them here is a patch request that essentially updates the title of the article. If I select that in the authorization header, I can see this is the value of the JWT that contains the claims information that we explored earlier in this video. If I copy this and move over to a decoder tool, I can paste the JWT in here to actually explore the claims that are encoded inside of it. Now, I specifically want to call out our issuer that we mentioned earlier is set to the same URL that was pasted inside of the Supabase dashboard. And then I also want to call out the sub value, which contains my user ID that I'm going to use to make sure that RLS only returns the records that I have access to. And to show this more concretely, I'm back in the Supabase dashboard. I'm going to select the table editor and then select the articles table here. And then we can see there are actually 3 articles listed here. Now, we had the first article that was shown in our sidebar, leveraging Supabase SaaS products. And then we have the new article we just created, which is Hello World. Now, I also want to point out there is another article here, a collaborative article, which is not listed inside of our sidebar. If I scroll over and I look at the owner ID values, we can see that the owner ID for articles 3 and 8 actually have my user ID. However, Article 4 has a completely different owner ID, which is why we're not able to access it from the sidebar as well. I hope you found this video informative and now have a better understanding of how the Clerk and Supabase integration functions on a deeper level. If you want to learn more about Clerk and Supabase, do me a favor, let me know in the comments. And with that, I'll see you in the next one. Thanks, bye-bye.